Hi, everyone, and welcome this afternoon to this session. I hope you can all hear me. You can? Great. It is 3:30, so we will start. And I will set the scene for you. And maybe I should just say good morning wherever you are, and good evening if you're in a place that's already evening. So what we wanted to do on this webinar is really discuss the global trade landscape and its ever-evolving and complex changes as a result of new regulation from the U.S. With the end of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and the recent implementation of new U.S. tariffs on businesses and economies, everyone is being forced to adapt. In this respect, this webinar, Navigating the New Trade Reality and Mitigating the Impact of the U.S. Tariffs on African Businesses, we want to really talk about the roadmap for this and how we can make sure that we understand what is going on. So I am just the mere moderator on this panel, but I'm joined by the very, very highly celebrated Jacquel Ferris, who is a partner or director in our Johannesburg office, and he's the sector head of the firm's industrial, manufacturing and trade sector. And he has a first-hand understanding of the on-the-ground impact of the trade tariffs and etc. on U.S. businesses, on African businesses in Africa, by the U.S. on African businesses. And then we're secondly joined by Patrick Childress, and Patrick is also very well renowned. He's a partner at Holland Knight and Holland and Knight LLP, and is a former Assistant General Counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Patrick brings invaluable insight into the legal and political drivers behind U.S. trade policy. His expertise will help us understand the U.S. perspective and really understand how to navigate the American regulatory environment. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon.
Thank you so much. So let's begin with Jacquel. From a South African perspective and broader African perspective, the imposition of these tariffs feels like a really significant blow. Can you walk us through the tangible impacts that you are seeing on businesses and economies? And in particular, what are the most affected sectors and what is the current strategy to absorb this shock? If you could let us know. Go ahead, Jacquel.
Thank you, Jerry. You framed that situation perfectly, and also just want to say good evening and good afternoon and good morning to the listeners wherever you are listening from. And as Jerry said, if you look at what's happened since the new U.S. administration came into took charge from January, February, there has been a significant change in the way the U.S. externally has operated from economic and tariff perspective. And it's not, I don't think anyone can be taken as a surprise, because the current sitting U.S. President Donald Trump has, during his campaign, in no uncertain terms, on various platforms, emphasized that he feels that the U.S. has been treated unfairly. And as a consequence of that, has used or seen tariffs as an instrument that can be used by the U.S. to basically create a fair global economic market that favors the U.S. and obviously putting the America First slogan there also. So, but when we look at what's happening on the ground from an African perspective, and in particular also in South Africa, being a South African, obviously the imposition of these tariffs are profound from economic and a geopolitical perspective, not just on South Africa, but the entire African continent. It also signals a major shift away from what we've known for decades as the preferential trade policies of the US under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or as some of you know it as AGOA. And while we are grappling with all of these new trade realities, I also want to maybe make this point and acknowledge that if you look at what the South African government has actually done from a diplomatic perspective, and probably has done more than any other African government to try and salvage the relationship with the US, is the president went to the US, Washington, a few months ago. There's been certain proposals by the South African government in the form of a framework deal. It has been proposed, extensive negotiations, and I think negotiations as we speak are still going on. One of the elements of the framework agreement was South Africa buying US LNG, also investing a reciprocal investment from South African companies into the US. But as we would have seen, again, despite all of these efforts by the South African government, South Africa still got imposed with the 30% tariff, which came into effect on the 8th of August 2025. And I just maybe want to mention something. So before this, we had this reprieve or 90-day reprieve period where there would have been negotiations. But it also, I think from a South African perspective, how this is viewed, it's more, so yes, it's the economic tariff perspective, but then it's also, it seems geopolitically, it's a stick, and the perception it's a stick that is being used against the South African government because of other policy decisions and other policy issues that the US government is unhappy with South Africa, whether it's expropriation, whether it's Black economic empowerment or other issues. So I just thought it's important to mention that. But on the ground, tangibly, when we talk about what is the actual impact of these tariffs, and tangibly speaking, if you look at our trade data over the past few months, the average US exports, or exports from South Africa to the US was about 2 billion odd to the US. If you look at the first quarter trade data, that has plummeted significantly, looking just at data from April to June, from 2 billion to less than 1 billion rand. So that's obviously a significant, sharp decline. And it does show you, even before this 30% became effective on the 8th of August, when traders react, they look at the policy uncertainty. We know that President Trump, every now and again, there's a different policy. So there's clear policy uncertainty, but if the traders react, and that's a clear impact on it. And if you look at what markets what sectors are being affected, specifically you mentioned, and Jerry, is actually, again, from an African perspective, and specifically South Africa, is precious stones and metals. The automotive industry has been significantly affected. And what South African officials have indicated, there's thousands of jobs at stake. And we've already seen tangibly so. We've seen Mercedes-Benz announce certain job losses. We've seen some of the other automotive manufacturers, Ford and a number of others, even other manufacturers who provide ancillary services or goods to these companies. So, but it's not just about South Africa, ultimately. From a continental perspective, we can see there's a varying amount of tariffs. Again, South Africa probably has the most highest tariffs at 30%. Then you have Ghana and Botswana, who average, I think, around 15%. And where you are at Kenya has probably one of the lowest tariffs. I think it's 10%, and Madagascar also around 10%. So you have these varying tariffs on the continent. And then we have one case that maybe stands out is Lesotho. So Lesotho has probably been impacted the most because, again, they have a single, what we can call a single exporting economy where they export textiles. And initially, there was a proposal of a 50% tariff on Lesotho, which ultimately didn't come to pass. But just the threat alone had significant consequences on Lesotho. You would see 80% of orders from the US were cancelled. Significant workforce reductions happened. The country actually had to declare a state of disaster in July as a consequence of this. So, and that obviously brings us maybe to the discussion about, you've mentioned, so what do we do? See, the US, if you look at it, it's still a significant consumer economy. 30% of the global consumer base is in the US. So you can't really disregard the US as a consumer-based economy where you need to export to. But I think from an African perspective, it's probably developing strategies for diversification, acknowledging, yes, the US is a big market, but we shouldn't be wholly and solely dependent on the US. And that's where maybe what we need to do from an African perspective. Again, we've spoken about this at length, I think, over months and years, the AFCFTA. That is probably a blueprint from an African perspective of what can we as Africans do to ensure that we actually do value addition on the continent, increase intra-African trade, and then create other markets on the continent. We have 1.3 billion plus people on the continent, and there's an untapped market there. Statistics, I think last week, the AFCFTA Secretariat has actually indicated over the past year that there has been a significant increase, or an increase, let me call it a significant increase in intra-African trade, but it's not enough. And diversification is key. So looking at other exporting economies or importing economies within the context of the global South, you have Saudi Arabia. You look at from a BRICS perspective, there's opportunities within BRICS. Obviously, what we also need to guard against from an African and South African perspective is where we become the dumping grounds for other countries. So it's creating that balance between value addition, diversification, getting new markets, but also making sure that we actually, because a lot of other countries, tariffs have also been imposed by China, against China and a number of other jurisdictions. So it's balancing, not being the dumping grounds by others, but also making sure that we diversify, add value to our products, and make sure that we actually can navigate this very, very difficult time. I think we have to acknowledge it's not going to happen overnight, but we can see tangibly that governments, whether it's the South African Lesotho government, the Kenyan government, there's tangible steps, it seems, being taken to make sure that we have to make sure that we still have a good relationship with the US, because they are a significant and important trading partner. But we also need to make sure that we diversify our exports to make sure that we can actually industrialize as a continent and not just export raw materials. So that's my opening remarks to your first question, Sanjeli. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. I think that's quite clear. I also want to just say to the audience that if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function and I will try and get to them as well. But I think just also to set the scene, Patrick, the reason you're here really is to tell us what is the thinking behind, this kind of the tariffs. What is the political, what is the legal basis for imposing this type of tariff? What is the aim? And can this aim really be achieved by imposing these heavy tariffs, which seems very arbitrary to us from an outside perspective?
Thank you, Njeri, and thanks, Jackwell, for that presentation. That was really great. So my plan today was to start off sort of laying the landscape for what's really going on from a U.S. perspective with the current administration's approach to international trade. Then I'll talk a little bit more about really there's two types of tariffs that I think folks should be aware of at the moment. And then I'll talk a little bit about approaches for dealing with this new trade landscape. So potential strategies for mitigating these tariffs. So starting off, sort of taking a broad view, in the past here in Washington, D.C., the consensus was that free trade was good for everyone, that all countries should focus on producing the goods that they can make most efficiently and effectively, and then they should trade for the rest. And in doing so, all countries will get wealthier and all people all around the world will benefit. So that consensus is now gone in Washington. And increasingly, there's a belief that, and this is particularly the case among the current administration, that the previous approach to free trade was not working. And in particular, it was not working for a specific segment of the American population. This is mostly lower wage, largely industrial workers, many of whom live in the American Midwest. And so the administration now is taking a very different approach. And the administration has been very clear what its goals are with this policy. And they say it right up front. They're not hiding the ball here. They come out and call it the America First trade policy. So this is a trade policy meant to benefit not the entire world, not America's trading partners, but the US population specifically. And in particular, the administration's focusing on 3 trade policy goals. The first is building up the US industrial base. The second is increasing American jobs and wages here in the United States. And then finally, it's lowering the US trade deficit with its trading partners around the world. And the primary tool that the administration has used, at least so far, to try to achieve those goals is tariffs. And there are really 2 types of tariffs that I think we should be aware of. The first is the so-called reciprocal tariffs. Now, these are the universal across-the-board tariffs that were put in place on essentially all products from all trading partners, and they've been around since April of this year. Importantly, these tariffs were put in place under a U.S. statute called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. And this will be important for a reason that I'll get to in just a minute. So that's the first type of tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs. The second type of tariffs that I wanted to highlight are the sectoral tariffs that apply to certain sectors of goods like steel and aluminum or autos. These tariffs were put in place under a different statutory authority called Section 232. Now, you've likely heard that the US tariffs are under challenge at the US Supreme Court. I just want to clarify one point here, that the only tariffs that are being challenged at the Supreme Court are those tariffs that were put in place under the IEEPA statute, not the Section 232 tariffs. So even if the Supreme Court ultimately rules against the administration's imposition of tariffs under IEEPA, the Section 232 tariffs would remain in place. Now, this does mean that, so say the Supreme Court were to strike down the IEEPA tariffs, there would likely be at least some period of lower overall tariffs on goods coming into the United States. But I just caution you that I don't think that this period would last particularly long. The administration has an array of other statutory authorities, including Section 232 and others like Section 301, which it can use to recreate and put back in place the same or very similar set of tariffs that would be eliminated if the Supreme Court ultimately strikes down the IEEPA tariffs. So what are our options here? And I guess more specifically here in Washington at Holland and Knight, how do we tend to advise clients on what to do in this situation? I think there's a couple of different ways to go about it. The first is regulatory tariff mitigation strategies. So that's talking to clients about whether there is a different HTS classification that we can use to import a product, which might have a lower tariff rate associated with it, whether there's a way to change the country of origin of a specific good to a country that's associated with a lower tariff rate. And this is particularly useful if we're dealing with complex goods with production processes that sometimes cross borders, sometimes multiple times during the production process. So country of origin is another thing we can look at. And then finally, we would look at valuation as well. So what is the valuation of the item that we import to US, that we report to US customs authorities? So here we're not changing the rate of the tariff, but we'd rather pay a tariff on $100 worth of goods rather than $200 worth of goods. So those 3 points, that's really sort of the regulatory strategy that we often use. And then second is proactive government strategies or lobbying the US government for changes in US trade policies. And this can be, certain companies might be seeking tariff relief for a certain product or some other type of change to US policy. And one important point to note there that, you know, when you're approaching the US government on these sorts of issues, you really want to keep in mind those 3 goals of US trade policy that I mentioned earlier. So building up the US industrial base, American jobs, and lowering the trade deficit. And you really want to think of ways that when you're speaking to the US government, you can frame your request in ways that are going to resonate and sort of support those 3 goals. So that's really critical and something to keep in mind going forward. And then, aside from that, this is going back to some of the points that Jackwell made very well. We advise clients to look if there are ways to diversify their supply chains and just generally have options so that you can be agile and react quickly when the U.S. government makes changes to the international trade landscape, because we've seen a lot of changes over the last 6 months or so, and we expect more down the road as well.
Okay, great. I mean, I have a few questions from what you've said, Patrick, so please allow me to go ahead. First of all, on the reasons for imposing of the tariffs and really building up America first, what is the general thinking between the political rhetoric and the actual reasons on the ground? Is there a basis for that, as opposed to just being a MAGA initiative?
Well, I think what I'd say there is that, these trade policies, while they might be, surprising to some in the speed with which they were put in place and maybe the scale of some of these policies, I would say that, as far as the type of policies that are put in place, there really shouldn't be too much of a surprise here because, throughout the campaign, the Trump campaign was very clear about what its goals were going to be with respect to the economy broadly, but also specifically on trade. So they were very clear, and if you go back to the first Trump administration, when the focus there was largely tariffs as well. And then, in the campaign leading up to Trump 2.0, again, they were very clear that tariffs would be a major tool that they would use for U.S. trade policy going forward.
Okay. On the second question I had is on the Section 2, what is the difference between the AGOA ones and the Section 232 tariffs?
Yeah, it's a great question. The AGOA statute is different in that these tariffs are put in place based on an emergency economic situation. And these can be put in place once the president declares that there's an economic emergency in place. And in this case, with respect to the reciprocal tariffs, the economic emergency that was used to justify these tariffs was the large and persistent trade deficit that the U.S. has with its trading partners. So the president was able to use that statute and put in place these tariffs very quickly. Section 232 is a little bit different in that it goes through the Department of Commerce here in the United States, and it requires an investigation and opportunity for public comment. And then the Commerce Department writes a report. And then on the basis of that report, the president can put in place tariffs on these specific sectors that are important for national security for the United States.
So the ones that actually affect us in Africa will be the ones that are at the Supreme Court then, and not the Section 232 ones.
So the Section 232 tariffs are affect imports from all countries around the world as well. It's just that it affects imports of these specific sectors. So to the extent that countries throughout Africa, for instance, export steel and aluminum or copper or automotives to the United States, then those exports going into the United States would face these Section 232 tariffs. And those tariffs will remain in place sort of irrespective of the outcome. Yeah.
Correct. So we're looking for a positive outcome at the Supreme Court for African tariffs that are affected by the economic emergency angle. Okay, great. And then on you talked about the mitigation strategies, and Jacquel, I'm coming back to you shortly. You talked about changing HTS classification. What does HTS stand for those who don't know?
Yeah, sorry, I should have been more clear there. Yeah, HTS stands for Harmonized Tariff System. This is a long list of categories under which you can import certain goods into the United States. So based on whatever good that it is being imported, you select the appropriate categorization. And some of these are very specific to very specific types of goods. And then once you select that the proper category for your good being imported, then a specific tariff rate applies to that good. So so one thing we help clients with is making sure that they're using the right HTS codes, because it could be the case that using a different code upon importation could result in better tariff treatment.
Okay. I mean, absolutely very key things that you've talked about in terms of mitigation strategies to get lower tariffs for your imports, for your exports. And Jacquel, you have talked about diversifying strategy. Could you talk a bit more about what does that mean, or how do you see it being implemented in the short term while we wait for a possible reprieve under AIBA, under the Supreme Court?
Thanks, Njeri. So, diversification, and that's a strategy adopted by several, I think, countries, including on the continent and including South Africa. But it's easier said than done to say that I'm going to diversify. So it's fairly complex question, and it's not let's call it a silver bullet. But I think it's from a African perspective, and particularly now speaking to South Africa, who is the biggest industrial country exporting significant amount of finished products in the form of manufactured goods such as automotives, which, as Patrick has indicated, those are actually the goods that are targeted and where significant tariffs are being imposed, because it goes against the policy of the administration saying that America first, you must manufacture in the US as opposed to anywhere else. And one of the issues there is, from a South African and an African perspective, it goes against the fundamentals of creating an industrial base on the continent. So it's this balancing act that needs to be played. But see, from an evidence perspective, again, to diversify requires significant investment in identifying the markets, identifying how it will be done, setting out the specifics, because all of these will cost money to divert exports from the US to any other market, making sure that there is actually a market to export. And we need to ensure that in doing so, we are fully aware of how we can actually do this. And that obviously requires companies and governments to sit together, which has been happening, and also going together to trade missions. So again, speaking from a South African perspective, a number of other countries have been identified. There's been a few trade missions that the South African government has had in the past 3 months to Japan and a number of other Asian jurisdictions to say, how do we tap into particular markets? There's also been certain concessions that has been granted by the Chinese government in respect of other exports in terms of agricultural products. So it's not the straightforward question of just redirecting your exports to a different jurisdiction, but making sure that actually you then grow that market where you intend to export to. Actively go out as has happened, and it's still very early phases of doing that, in getting and ensuring that there's actually a market. What the other thing that the South African government has actually done to encourage this diversification, or part of the diversification strategy, is this proposed draft block exemption for promotion of export regulation. So it's basically it allows for competitors or competing exporters to collaborate on things like sharing market information, developing joint export infrastructure to achieve economies of scale and efficiencies, which in a normal course would be against the antitrust laws of South Africa. I'm not a competition lawyer, but I think our competition lawyers can speak better to that. But so those are the strategies that has been adopted to say, how do we do this where companies can actually work together to identify markets or measures to tap into this. So it's obviously a short-term cushion. It's not a permanent solution in the long-term diversification efforts that are taking shape, but it is happening. from an African perspective, it's about damage control, because as I mentioned, there's real tangible impact that is currently happening as a consequence of this. And we need to make sure that although the pain is immediate, if there is immediate pain we are facing as a continent, we have to make sure that in the long term, we can at least have a cushion against something similar happening again. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah. Do you know, Jaco, maybe you can speak about this. What sectors are most affected by this at the moment, and how are they managing those mitigation strategies?
So the sectors, as I mentioned earlier, it's more on finished products. So yes, there is the raw materials, oils and minerals, but it's actually the finished products that are more significantly affected. And that again goes to the issue about, from an African perspective, when we talk about value addition, we actually want to have an economy continentally, and that's really what the AfCFTA speaks to, is to have manufactured high value products that we can export to the likes of the US and so on. But those are the actual products that are actually being targeted. And maybe Patrick can add a bit more to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we're looking on the African continent to industrialize and really become our own source of finished products, whereas the US has now lowered tariffs on unfinished and raw materials, meaning that there isn't that incentive for African businesses to actually industrialize. It's actually negating our own incentives. How do we deal with that? Patrick or Jackwell, whichever.
Patrick, maybe go first.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe one thing I would just flag in this area is that right now, this sort of in the initial wave of these Section 232 sectoral tariffs on sectors like steel and aluminum, copper, and then we're expecting forthcoming tariffs on other industries like timber and lumber as well. I think the initial wave will be focused to at least some extent on the raw materials that you're discussing. But in addition to that, however, I don't think that'll be the end of the story, because the administration has been using what they're calling inclusions processes related to these Section 232 tariffs. So the initial wave of tariffs will come out, and then there will be a process whereby they will solicit input from US stakeholders in these industries, asking them if there are additional finished or further downstream products that should be added within the scope of the tariffs. And we saw this recently on steel and aluminum, where there were significant additions to the scope of the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs to include finished goods that incorporate steel and aluminum. So now it's the case that imports of these finished goods that include steel and aluminum are facing 232 tariffs based on the aluminum content of those goods. So if it's a mixed good that has aluminum parts but then other components as well, then whatever percentage of the value of that good is made up of the steel or aluminum content, then the tariff is imposed on that percentage of the good's overall value.
I mean, that is really brutal, especially for African businesses. And just so that we are all on the same page as well, is there an incentive to renegotiate an Africa trade deal, kind of a renewal of AGOA, or even a new deal with the African Union, for example, to really protect African manufacturers in this space? Patrick.
Sure. So I think it's a great idea. It would be very useful and potentially beneficial for countries throughout Africa. However, I don't have high hopes that the US is going to engage with the continent on a multilateral basis. The current administration is very focused on bilateral trade negotiations. They feel that they have more leverage in bilateral negotiations than they do negotiating sort of with the US being a counterparty to a group of countries. So, while I do think it could be valuable from the African perspective to enter into those sort of multilateral negotiations, I would just caution that I don't think there's a high chance that there would be an appetite from the U.S. administration's perspective to enter into that sort of multilateral negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, you started off by saying it's a good idea. It's not my idea. It's desperately needed. So I guess that's saying it's a good idea is a good indication of the willingness there is for it not to happen. Jacquel, I want to go on to you. What legal protections can we talk about on the African continent that will really make sure that whatever tariffs are imposed, we're able to combat these successfully to make sure that we remain relevant?
Yeah, I think maybe what I first want to just also address, and I think it's an important point, which touches on your question, is just again looking at, and this is probably not just a US problem. It has been, we can call it a global problem of tariff escalation, where when we talk about Africa and products from Africa, more raw products, then lower tariffs are applied, and when it's refined or products or finished products, then a much higher tariff is imposed. So what the US has done is exacerbated the issue in particular. And what we must also maybe consider, and if you've raised the point about is there appetite from a US perspective to negotiate a potential multilateral agreement? And yeah, the way Donald Trump operates is everything is bilateral. He wants to conclude deal by deal. It seems go through each country and negotiate against each other. But from a specific African, and maybe that's also where the danger lies for Africa, because on these bilateral deals, because pegging each other against each other, saying, I can give you this 10% Kenya, I can give Ghana 15%, and South Africa, you're very naughty, you deserve 30%, even if there's a case to be made, there should actually be less. So it's just what we call creating, so a big player like the US creating a position where there's actually a race to the bottom. So I will give you the raw material, I'll give you this, but you don't need to do anything on the continent. So we're becoming competitors against each other, but not in a good way. So I think we need to make sure that we try and avoid that. That's why from an African perspective, there must be a unified approach in terms of how do we deal with, and that's maybe one of the answers to your question. So unity from an African perspective in terms of how do we deal with this, because we're not going to achieve the objectives set out in the AFCFTA in terms of making sure that Africa as a whole industrializes and also identifies, because it shouldn't be competition amongst African countries. It's identifying particular regions on the continent where we say, okay, you are good in manufacturing automotives, you're good in doing X, Y, and Z. And that's how we're going to create regional value chains in Southern Africa, East Africa, and West Africa, and we can then compete with the world. And we are then, so that's diversification, but also making sure that we are equal player on the in the global context.
I mean, I love that conversation. It's just that it's happening here and not at the governmental level. Have you seen any movement on the governmental level to really bring that kind of thinking to the fore?
It is happening, and maybe not as quick as we would like it, but I think there's clear urgency now. So I know from a South African government perspective, there has been discussions about that with other African governments in terms of how do we do this. But it's not just about the governments, it's about the private sector taking the initiative to ensure that these things are done, because the private sector feels it on the cold face, and ultimately it results in job losses. And if the politicians then feel it, because they now need to go and campaign and say, but yeah, I'm not going to win another term as a consequence of job losses. So it's both the private sector and government. But what I've seen from a South African government perspective is there is actually an actual attempt. I actually got a WhatsApp earlier from a client saying he's joining this trade mission to the US to go in again to talk to the US about certain specific aspects. So there is active engagement both from private and government sector. But I think we need to be more aggressive on a continental level, where we're not played against each other, basically.
Yeah. And for Patrick, what practical steps can you advise African exporters to take in this regard, in terms of restructuring their supply chains, diversifying their markets, anything that they can do and that you would advise your clients to do?
Right. So restructuring and diversifying, I think those are all wise approaches. As Jackwell mentioned, these are things that take time and investment. They're not things that can happen overnight. And we've heard from a lot of clients that before they make these big investments in both time and money for large diversification strategies, maybe they want to wait a little bit to see where we land in terms of the U.S. Trade policy approach. And I think that can be wise because there has been so much change over the last 9 months that maybe you might want to wait for the dust to settle a little bit before you make some of these major investments. So I think in the shorter term, some of the strategies that you can undertake today relate to some of those custom strategies that I mentioned earlier, related to the HTS codes, related to country of origin, related to valuation. And then in the second piece is in certain situations, it could make sense to try to engage the U.S. government directly for some sort of tariff relief as well. And I will say there, and I'll make this point because I feel like so far my presentation has been a little bit gloomy. I will say that I think there is a shift happening within the U.S. government, and that is that the government is now more open to hearing from stakeholders and potentially making changes to its approach to tariff policy, at least at the margin, for specific goods in specific situations. And I think we saw this recently in the case of the additional tariffs that were imposed on Brazil. So along with those additional 40% tariffs on Brazil, there was also an annex of goods that were exempted from those tariffs as well. And it was quite a long annex. And one of the main drivers that got a good included on that annex was whether or not there was a domestic market for those goods. So, one good in particular we can highlight is acai berries. So acai berries, I don't know a lot about them. I know they turn smoothies purple, and I know that you can only make them in Brazil. So that's the only place acai berries grow. So you can put whatever tariffs you want on these berries, 100%, 200%, 500%. The farmers in Iowa aren't going to be able to grow these acai berries. And so I think there's a recognition there that there's no domestic market now for this product, and there never will be a domestic market for this product. And then we saw that acai berries made their way onto this annex for exemption from those additional Brazilian tariffs. So I think that points to a broader shift in the administration's approach, that there is an opening there to hear from stakeholders and perhaps provide tariff relief, again, for these very targeted goods in specific situations.
I mean, that's a very good example, and I hope that we can point towards specific goods in Africa that also can benefit from this type of exemption. That makes sense. I just want to go beyond the current tariffs, Jackwell, and perhaps maybe also Patrick. What are the emerging trends in global trade for African companies that we should either be concerned about or we can be optimistic about? And this is beyond AGOA.
Yeah, I think the global trends from a trade perspective, maybe this is again a negative one, is the protectionism. And we don't just see it with the US, but the US is the biggest example now of protectionist policies that are creeping in, and where literally the rule book has been thrown out of the window. So there's no such thing as WTO anymore, although they exist, and all the multilateral agreements that goes with it. But it's also from a regional perspective. We saw this year, we also had BRICS and BRICS summit that was held in Brazil. And the commitment again from what we can call the global south is that there needs to be greater collaboration and work with each other to ensure that from an economic perspective, there is, and again, I'm picking back again on diversification, not becoming too dependent on it. I think the big ones for me is again this protectionism, which we've spoken about probably ad nauseum, but also BRICS and the global south and identifying opportunities within BRICS. But I think one caution we must also maybe pronounce is that what I mentioned, I think earlier, is that yes, BRICS and the global south, but we must also be cautious not to become a dumping ground for other countries, because if we take an example of and maybe this one is to some extent a good example, but it also creates a paradox problem where there has been, as far as I understand, some tariffs also imposed on India in respect of textiles, and they're now looking at diversification. And the big word in this webinar is diversification. And they're looking at countries like Kenya and Ethiopia to say, how do we set up facilities or manufacturing facilities for the export of, again, textiles from those countries. But again, so there's good in that, but there's also the potential that we are now creating an uneven ground between ourselves. So that's maybe my takeaway on this particular point. Maybe Patrick can add a bit more.
Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with all those points completely. And sort of building on one of the points Jackwell was making, in particularly in the context of China. So as we've seen the U.S. putting up barriers to imports from China, and then also increasingly recruiting allies to do the same. So we've seen Mexico also putting up new tariffs on Chinese goods as well. So it's going to be harder for Chinese goods to reach certain markets. That does not mean that China is going to stop producing those goods. I think China has been very clear and very focused in its industrial policy, and it wants to be export focused. So China is going to keep producing, and there's going to, in the end, they're going to be seeking out markets for those goods. I think one place where we could see even more Chinese goods showing up is throughout the African continent. So that would be something I can keep an eye on. I would keep an eye on. And then secondly is, and this is an idea that Jackwell raised as well, we've seen, as tariffs rise on certain trading partners to the United States, and India is a great example. So we now have the 50% tariffs on India. I think there might be an impulse from Indian producers to move some of their production offshore, perhaps to new factories, new investments in Africa. And the idea would be these Indian companies would continue doing part of the work and part of the production of, saying, let's take textiles, for example. So maybe they continue to create and source textiles within India, and then they would ship those textiles to a new factory somewhere in Africa, substantially transform those goods into the final product in Africa, and then ship those final products from Africa to the United States with a country of origin from a country in Africa that has a lower tariff rate than India right now. So that might be another strategy that we see more going forward. And that could mean more investment on the African continent. So something else to keep an eye on there.
I mean, that's perhaps the most positive thing that you've said in the whole webinar, because actually it creates other opportunities for African businesses to actually take part in the manufacturing process. And then, the country of origin, as you said, will then be changed. So there are opportunities that we can take advantage of, short of negotiating directly with the American government. So that's great. I wanted to give the opportunity to the audience in the last 10 minutes to give us, to ask questions if they have. I know I did see that Landiwe had a question. Your hand was raised at some point. I can give you the floor now.
Thank you very much. I mean, thanks for this very for this webinar. No, my question was really if maybe the two speakers can comment on what seems to be a meeting that will be taking place sometimes this week between US and China and South Korea. Is it something that we should expect much from that, or is it just simply a bilateral meeting between China and the US? Does it tell us, does it signal us anything just in terms of the change of policy with regards to tariff? I just thought maybe I should ask that. Thank you.
I think Patrick will be best to answer that.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I don't have much sort of inside information here, but I can say broadly that I do think it's very positive that it looks like there has been a renewed an acceleration in the U.S.-China trade talks, and I think that's a good thing. We want to have the United States and China on good speaking terms and working toward a resolution of some of these trade issues. I think that the near-term meetings between the U.S. and China, I think there will be a focus on resolving the TikTok issue, and perhaps some of the more like core international trade issues might not be focused on in as much depth as we might hope. But hopefully, these meetings this week sort of set the stage for continued dialogue between the U.S. and China, sort of at the highest levels, but then also at the lower levels as well, because we need sort of at the lower government official level, we need further ongoing negotiation as well to get at some of these really sticky and ongoing trade issues that exist between the two countries.
Okay. We have a question from Willie, and Willie, it's good to see you here, practicing in Cameroon. In your practice, do you encounter African companies that are considering utilizing the AfCFTA to offset US tariffs? So have you seen that, Jackwell, in practice?
So there has been discussions. A few of our clients and prospective clients have raised the possibility of how to tap in to the AfCFTA, but the problem, I think, is key. From a client perspective, is first identifying the specific market from an expert perspective. And one example could probably be, and this is not directly linked to what we've done, is what has happened in Namibia in particular, where we see that there's been a number of different segments. In particular, I think they've started the first export of also refined, probably in a small context, but refined salt from Namibia into other African jurisdictions. Other clients that we've helped is more from considering investment issues around, say, the AfCFTA investment protocol, how from an investment structuring perspective and to the risk of if I invest in the DRC, if I invest in Kenya, and when the full suite of all the protocols come into effect, what is the potential? So let's take the example of the DRC. So if something goes wrong in the DRC with my investment, is my investment still protected because it's a consequence of the AfCFTA investment protocol coming into effect? Some of those bilateral investment agreements that are in existence between African states will then also lapse, and you wouldn't have the protection that you typically find in sunset provisions. So those are the things that where companies have started considering them, also creating of the regional value chain, saying, if you look at South Africa, and this is a battery manufacturer, saying, do we set up a shop in Zimbabwe or Zambia, obviously having regard to the fact that there's a lot of lithium being mined within the Southern African region? Does it make sense to set up a facility in Zambia or Zimbabwe, because also South Africa is one of the bigger manufacturers of automotives, and obviously there's a big policy around green automotives and also the export of those automotives more so to the European Union or to Europe. So there is that, but I think in talking about heavy industries, exporting vehicles from South Africa into the rest of the continent. It's happening on a very marginal scale. And that's where we need to focus on, and making sure that those type of heavy industrial processes are actually also there's a market for that. The other big one, I think, again, speaking from a South African perspective, is mining equipment. So obviously South Africa manufactures a lot of mining equipment, and those are exported within the continent. But you still find a lot of difficulties in even moving goods on the continent. So we face so many other obstacles, and this is part of diversification, but there's also obstacles in infrastructure, whether it's the ports, whether it's the rails, whether it's actually the border control issues that we are facing. So, and that's what, as from an African perspective, we need to deal with. We can advise all we want, but there are all these obstacles that we need to deal with to make sure that it is actually workable.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the African continent will be giving a lot of advice on the implementation of the FCTFA, but not really any real moves to really use businesses to the advantage because of the implementation at a national level of the Act. Yeah. Okay. I have a comment here from Remo Benjamin, who I believe is one of our new partners. And he says strategy plans for intercontinental trade in response to U.S. tariff hikes. But I think that question has been answered. But please correct me if I'm wrong in looking at diversification and also in the AFCTFA. Remo?
I saw that comment. Is Remo?
Maybe he's not here with us anymore.
Just trying to find to unmute his mic.
Oh, okay.
Remo, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much. I've also been trying from my side. Yeah, thank you for the presentation and all the comments. And yeah, that question was asked about very at the beginning. I think there's been delved into, but I think Jacko, and I think the challenges we have, and you've touched on it as well, intercontinental, multilateral, and then the bilateral approach from the U.S. administration. So obviously there is a lot of plans and strategies that needs to go in. You've answered it, but if you can maybe expand, if you can. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Remo. I will attempt to expand further. So, as I mentioned, I think the AFCFTA is one of the key, if not the most important instruments from an African perspective that all African businesses should be looking at to say, how do we actually ensure we diversify? But diversifying is, again, it's a statement that can be made, and it's an easy statement we are all making and say, yes, you diversify, but it's actually to do so, we need to acknowledge, and I think our leaders from each of our countries and also leaders of industries do acknowledge that we have fundamental constraints on the continent. And those constraints are not easy ones. If we look at the one big thing in the stuff that we also work on a lot is on infrastructure. So infrastructure is probably the most fundamental constraint on the African continent, whether it's transport, whether it's ports, whether it's rail. And I maybe make one example. So last week, and this is a very real example happening last week. So, and it's about a conference. So last week we had a conference in Johannesburg on hydrogen economy and how all of this, and we can export to the EU and Germany and all the other derivatives and products. So one of the attendees who attended the conference he came from Mauritania. So there's no direct flights from Mauritania to Johannesburg. He had to take a flight from the capital in Mauritania. He had to fly, I think he said, to Germany or out of the continent and back to Johannesburg. So he had to spend his time traveling for 48 hours, essentially. And that's just one example. Someone that's trading services, someone trying to come, that's also trade. So someone trying to come to another African country, it takes you 48 hours just to get here. So those are the fundamental bottlenecks that we as a continent need to urgently deal with. Not that there is a lot of discussion in talk, but we need to urgently deal with it. The other is if I'm selling a refined product and I'm sending it to Kenya, it can't cost me double the cost that it's going to cost to send to the US. Then I can rather export it to the US because the 30% tariff then doesn't really matter because of the cost of getting the product there. So AFCFTA is very important and it is starting to work, but we need to deal with the bottlenecks. The estimated cost to deal with it by I think the World Bank and the African Development Bank estimates that we need to spend about $100 billion per annum to reduce the infrastructure deficit. And that can only be done also through the private sector because governments don't have the money. We need to look at private PPPs in particular to see how we reduce the gap. So trade is fundamentally linked to infrastructure. If you don't have the infrastructure, then we're not going to get there. Again, not that we are not doing it. There's a number of good infrastructure projects that are in completion where this highway between Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, which interlinks the different countries, and the proposed railway expansion of ports in Tanzania and in Kenya. So it is happening, but probably not at the scale and pace that we want it to happen. Hopefully that answers some of it.
Yeah. One more question. Well, he's putting his hand up, so it's great. Thumbs up. One more question from Engineering News, which is, from what I understand from some South African export councils, diversification is difficult, takes time, and serves more to change the risk profile of businesses than to provide additional profits, at least for the first few years as they grow in these new markets. Surely any diversification strategy, whether private or public, would have to take a long-term view and even beyond the end of the current US administration. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's what we fundamentally saying, and that's again, we are not economists, we are merely lawyers, but we're seeing it on the ground. Saying the pain is going to be there. The pain is going to be firsthand, and in order to diversify, you have to go through there's going to be a fundamental cost. So investments would need to be made both in the particular African country where the exports are being exported from, and whatever goods are being produced and exported, but also on the other side, the time, effort, market information, whether it's again to China or to Brazil or to South Korea, there's going to be the effort in all of that. So it's not an immediate benefit you're going to see. It will probably take you at least a few years to see the tangible benefit of diversification, because you can't just switch. There's no switch that we can say we're switching from the US to whoever. It's going to take time. It's going to take money. We're going to feel the pain, and we're already feeling the pain. So rather feel the pain now, which we're already feeling, and try and diversify, get the diversification process and strategy in place, and then at least when something like this happens again, hopefully not, then we are a bit more resilient. And maybe that's the word I want to leave us with, resilience, because we will build resilience through diversification. But it will cost money.
But I also agree that any strategy needs to look at beyond the US administration, because we can't be subject to any changes at the whim of one political strategy over another. I just want to take the time to say thank you very much, Jackwell. Thank you very much, Patrick, for all of your contributions. I think you guys have been really great at explaining the issue and letting us understand what we need to do in the short term and the long term to build on this, on the fact that tariffs are here. Tariffs are here to stay. We cannot rely on any Supreme Court decision or even whimsical decision of a Trump administration to build on what has already been done on the African continent. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm going to do that now. My name is Jerry. I'm a corporate partner at CTH in the Nairobi office. I've been the moderator for this session. Thank you very much for joining us. You've been excellent, and I hope you learned something along the way. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and it's only Monday. We'll get there. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.